Now, the United Nations is warning that millions of people are on the verge of starvation unless ports in southern Ukraine, which have been closed because of the war, are reopened. The UN Food Agency said the global food crisis is already impacted by the coronavirus pandemic and climate change.
The conflict, which enters its fourth month tomorrow, has closed Ukraine's Black Sea ports, halting food exports to many developing countries. David Beasley, head of the UN Food, says failure to open the ports will be a declaration of war on global food security.
A year ago, you had Ethiopia, then you had Afghanistan, and then the breadbasket of the world. This now got the longest bread lines of the world. And so now, because of this crisis, we're taking food from the hungry to give to the starving. It's absolutely a crisis mode. What do you think is going to happen when you take a nation that normally grows enough food to feed 400 million people and you sideline that? What do you think is going to happen? And so when you add the fuel costs, food costs, shipping costs, it's devastating to not just our operations, but to global food security. And if we don't get the port of Odessa open, it's only going to compound our problems, because we've got to get those fields back operational. We've got to get those silos full again, but they can't get the silos empty unless we get the ships flowing. It's critical.
The escalating food security crisis, which has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, is predicted to affect the global hunger stat, which is currently at its peak, doubling in just 2 years from 135 million before the pandemic to 276 million. Meanwhile, Beasley hopes the reopening of some ports will not restrict Russian food and fertilizer, which Moscow is the world's second largest exporter.
Well, for some reaction, we're now joined by Oxfam America's Director of Humanitarian Policy and Programs, Shannon Scribner. Shannon, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. As the world, I suppose, leaders, business leaders, political leaders converge on Davos, what would you like them to know as Oxfam?
Thank you so much for having me. So to answer your question, yes, ahead of the World Economic Forum, Oxfam always talks about inequality. So this is the first time that world leaders, business leaders have come together face to face in 2 years since the pandemic. And during this time, 20 million people have died as a result of COVID. And we've also seen inequality grow at a staggering rate. So I think we would have two things that we would want members of the World Economic Forum to really acknowledge. The first is that over the last couple of years, inequality has really grown, especially between billionaires, many of those who are attending the Economic Forum, and the rest of us. At the same time, there is global food crises, as already mentioned, especially in East Africa and the Sahel, where 23 million people are in need of assistance in East Africa and over 27 million people in the Sahel. And so those two things need to be acknowledged if we have any hope of the global cooperation on economic and social issues of our day that are discussed at the World Economic Forum.
All right. Give us a sense of this global inequality that we're seeing. You mentioned the billionaires, and I think you came out with a report that, $453 billion richer in the last 2 years, these billionaires. And it seems somehow criminal that people could expand their wealth at a time of crisis.
Absolutely. Today, we launched a report called Profiting from Pain. And that's exactly what has happened over the last couple of years. Billionaires have gotten richer. So over the last couple of years, every 30 hours, the report outlines how there has been one billionaire created, while at the same time, 1 million people have fallen into extreme poverty. And these rates are just staggering, something we've never seen before, and something that there are winners during the pandemic, and then there are those who haven't profited, and then, of course, the 20 million people who lost their lives. And it does seem criminal and sickening to look at those numbers.
You've been dealing with inequality for many, many decades, many years. And I just wonder, why is the penny not dropping? What is it that we're seeing this growing inequality over time?
So lots of factors. I mean, certainly over the last couple of years, the economic slowdown due to the pandemic has really impacted the world, and it's impacted people's ability to make a livelihood, to make a living for themselves. But we've also had other factors as well. Of course, we've had conflict in Ethiopia, and then we've had conflict in the Sahel. We've had extreme weather events, climate. Both the Sahel and East Africa are experiencing the driest time that they've experienced in decades. And then on top of that, we have the skyrocketing prices of food, and then the conflict in Ukraine has exacerbated that further. So everything is compounded, and families and people trying to survive can't catch a break. Just when you think things can't get worse, they do get worse. So people don't have the income to pay for food. They don't have food available in lots of places. And right now in East Africa, every 48 seconds, one person is dying of hunger.
The way things are supposed to work is that you get rewarded for effort. Are these billionaires getting rewarded for working better, working smarter, being more productive? What's happening?
So one thing that we talk about in the Profiting from Pain is that it's not as if people getting richer are working any harder. It's the circumstances of their businesses, what they've been able to benefit from, but they aren't working harder. But we know that farmers in Ethiopia and in South Sudan and other places are working harder. We have families and stories from the people that we work with that had 150 goats and have 2 goats left. And what they're trying to do now is find a place where they can have food or fodder for their remaining animals. They're trying to find clean water, any water for their families or them to drink. They're trying to find food that is not available, or if it is, it's just too expensive. So it's the people who are experiencing extreme poverty that seem to be working harder than they've ever had to before, and simply to survive, not to make a profit.
What can the politicians, the governments do to deal with this inequality?
So at the World Economic Forum and in all of Oxfam's inequality work, we talk about taxing extreme wealth and taxing corporations. In many cases, we have examples throughout our report that we've mentioned where billionaires are taxed less than their cleaner or their secretary. So the taxing of the very wealthy and taxing of big corporations is important for even to get us to start moving in the right direction. And then in terms of the inequality, or in terms of the food insecurity that we're witnessing, we don't have enough funding for the programs in East Africa or in Sahel to respond properly. So we need the United Nations humanitarian appeals to be fully funded, and we need the political will of the international community, but also governments in these countries to really address all the different drivers that are creating crisis for far too many people.
How are they allowed to get away with this? It seems as if it's almost gangster type behavior that's playing out here, and that they're allowed to get away with it.
It will be interesting to see what comes out of the World Economic Forum in terms of statements on extreme inequality or in terms of acknowledgement of food insecurity. I mean, right now we have 193 million people across 53 countries that are experiencing acute hunger. How much will that be talked about? Because again, going back to the purpose of the World Economic Forum, you cannot create any kind of global cooperation on social and economic issues if you're not addressing this issue of global food insecurity, but also the extreme inequality that people are facing. And it's not getting better, it's getting worse. It already existed before the conflict in Ukraine, but that is certainly compounding and impacting the food crisis and inequality issues globally.
All right. I think you might have mentioned this at the beginning, but which sectors are you finding are the ones that are exacerbating this inequality?
In terms of the drivers, are you speaking about the drivers? Yes. So absolutely. So economic slowdown would be number one due to the pandemic that has been felt in almost every country around the world. Extreme weather events, climate change has definitely impacted, especially in the Sahel and East Africa. Conflict is another driver that we're seeing, and insecurity in a lot of the countries that have been impacted. And then just economic shocks. So the Ukraine conflict would be a good example of an economic shock. And, the communities that Oxfam works with are resilient, but there gets to a point when you have no more resiliency if it just keeps getting compacted and compounded further. And that is where we are right now with many communities that are just feeling a helplessness and have no more resiliency left. So people need assistance, and they need acknowledgement from the world leaders at the forum that people need help right now.
And this inequality, is this right across the world, or are there some regions that are more vulnerable than others? We've always felt extremely left behind here in Africa. We must be one of the most vulnerable regions.
Absolutely. When we look at just inequality just around the world, it is linked to colonialism and the impact that it has had on countries all around the world, and how much that has really set countries back, and how much it continued following colonialism as well. And so the impact of inequality is felt very deeply in lots of regions around the world, Africa in particular. If we look at the countries, so in the Sahel and East Africa, the majority of people almost on the brink of famine are in, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Sudan. It's the Central African Republic, Mali, Niger, Guinea-Bissau. So these are the countries where people don't have the resources right now to fight not only the food insecurity that they're experiencing, but they're experiencing conflict, they're experiencing climate shock. So these countries and kind of those regions are impacted disproportionately compared to the rest of the world. Not saying that there's not food insecurity other places and need other places, but it's certainly felt in a way that is not felt in other places.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you so much indeed for joining us and highlighting this very, very important and critical issue. And let's hope that those that are gathered at Oxfam put it high on the agenda and that they actually do something about it. Thank you so much for pointing the way for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, good night. All right, so that was Oxfam America's Director and Humanitarian Policy and Programs, Shannon Scribner. And just to tell you, when we talk about inequalities, it was shocking to hear some of the things that she says, that a new billionaire is created every 30 hours during this pandemic. And with every new billionaire created, 1 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. And also, just to give you a sense of the inequality, the richest 20 people, 20 billionaires are worth more than the entire GDP of sub-Saharan Africa. 20 people. That is the inequality that we're dealing with, and perhaps some of the issues that really need to be put on the table at places like Davos. All right, after the break, we'll be going to the DRC and again the M23 rebels. Big